So first of all, we'll start by thinking a little bit about the form that urban development takes today in Mumbai. And you know, since a lot of you are architects, and one question that we could you know, legitimately ask coming to Mumbai is, you know, if you had to give the name of one architect which has really defined more than anybody else the landscape of Mumbai today and the architecture of Mumbai today, it's style, architectural style. I mean, the style of the last 10 years, let's say. No, it'd be very hard to say. I mean, you could say Charles Correa, but Charles Correa is from before. Charles Correa is, of course, a very famous architect from Mumbai. He's built a few buildings, but you know, by no means is defined, you know, the city in any way architecturally. You probably have to say Hafiz contractor. We can go to the next slide. And you know, that's typically the type of buildings he would build. So you know, it's a very generic type architecture. It doesn't really have a character of its own. And that's you know, something we see all over the place, especially in Asian cities these days. That's a, you know, kind of like standard you know, type of housing or office buildings, which is basically developed by financial, you know, flows. So it's like it's based on an idea of, you know, speculative notion of space. And how do you, you know, maximize the value of space by its tradability? So, you know, once you build, these buildings are you know, typically something which would be a consortium in New Delhi or in Hong Kong, you know, has some money to invest in real estate. The financial markets are very hot these days, and Mumbai is a good market. And so you invest, you know, some capital. It becomes a building, and the more generic the building will be, the more tradable it will be also. So the highest value will be.
And it's also very strongly linked to the idea of aspiration, the idea of the future, because the architectural style over here is again based on very stock notions of what is futuristic urbanism. Now, it may actually seem very laughable because this may be very retro. It may be something which is already out of sync, you know, in a certain way. But definitely the idea that this is what the city aspires to is something which Hafiz contractor constantly satisfies.
Yeah. By the way, if you're looking for a job as an architect in Mumbai, you know, that's the place to go. I mean, of course, the projects won't be very interesting, but he has got like 400 you know, people on CAD working all day, all night, and it's basically like a sweatshop for architecture. But you know, architects are often complaining that Mumbai is not a good city for architects these days because it's all about development. It's all about real estate development. That's what's really happening today in Mumbai. So we'll show you a few examples of this. If you can go next slide. You know, that's Planet Goldridge. It's a new building that was just built maybe in the past year. It was opened up. And yeah. So this building is mostly rented by corporations, and you know, the style of construction is actually the quality of construction is very poor. The material is very poor, but it was built so fast, and it's selling. And the rents, you know, can be as high as $5,000 a month or more. You know, so the price of housing and renting is extremely high. You can go next. That's an image from the Phoenix Mall, and you know, again, that's the kind of like shopping mall culture is, you know, coming to Mumbai as well. That's a you know, mall located in the center of Mumbai. Lots of the malls are, of course, more in the suburbs, and the building you see behind is a building which replaces one of the old cotton mill. Mumbai used to have a very kind of strong industrial history with lots of cotton mills, and they've been now dismantled and replaced by high-rise, usually housing development. You can go to the next slide. Again, the relationship to the street is being redefined often in those type of constructions. You've seen maybe on your way here, you know, just on the bus, how lively the street. I mean, actually today is a special day because it's a holiday, but still, I mean, you've probably seen that, you know, there's people in the street, and that's, I mean, you'll see tomorrow, you'll see every day. It's one of the most lively, you know, type of streetscape, you know, that you can find anywhere. But of course, this changes with different types of development, which promote, of course, more, you know, car-oriented transportation, underground parkings, and high-rise housing. So it also redefines the city is changing in that way also. You can go. That's an image from Navi Mumbai. So this is the new Bombay, which was built. I just mentioned it before. And I started in the 80s. It's a project of Charles Correa and Shirish Patel. They initiated the whole idea of Navi Mumbai. Then it got a bit out of hand, and for now the land is just being sold a bit. To anybody who wants to come and build something. So this is typically a landscape that you will see all around the suburbs, like far out suburbs of Mumbai. That's the new city, the new greater Mumbai happening. And so in a way we could say Mumbai is a post-architecture city. Architects don't matter that much. It's all about real estate development. And we could even maybe say provocatively that Mumbai is a post-planning city. The Bandra Kurla complex, this is an image from the Bandra Kurla complex, which is the new financial center of Mumbai, and and also therefore the new financial center of India, because Bombay is the financial capital of India. And this is one of the last big urban planning projects of the city. It's a project which was started 30 years ago, and it's meant to be decongesting the center and bringing businesses over there. But it's one of the it's actually very poorly planned in many different ways. Environmentally, it led to the pollution of the whole mangrove reservation area, and in terms of just the civic infrastructure, there's almost no street lights. There's no, it's absolutely not mixed use. The whole of Mumbai is very mixed use. This place is completely dead at night, which makes it, one of the only places in Mumbai which is scary to walk out at night. And of course, the story is always, one which is to be seen in parallel with the story of the building industry, the construction industry, which is also a big source of immigration. And the people who actually work in the construction industry often end up being those who develop the first so-called slums. So the history of informal settlements in Mumbai and the history of the formal city, the planned city, are completely interlinked. Next slide. That's an image of a vision for another big planning project of the city, which is the Dharavi Redevelopment project. And this is not the image of the final project, because there is no final project right now. It's
Dharavi is the setting of Slumdog Millionaire, the neighborhood, which is very central, and this is what a lot of planners, and particularly Mukesh Mehta, thinks in terms of transforming it. So this is the future of Dharavi, as imagined by Mr. Mukesh Mehta.
We'll show you some images of Dharavi a bit later, but basically the notion again is one which is a very kind of like industrial era planning ideology, in which you would separate housing from work and work from leisuring. So and this is all seen as being high-rise development, and some housing will be left also for the current residents. About 25 to 1/3 of the current residents of Dharavi will be able to stay in the new redevelopment project. So, yeah. Okay. So this is an image of in Dharavi. This is how the Metropolitan Authority of Mumbai are communicating the redevelopment plan of Dharavi to the population. So they put a few billboards, and if you go to the next slide, this is the type of imagery. This is the type of like proposed vision.
Running water, wide roads, playgrounds. This is the sort of standard sense of aspiration for people, what imagined aspiration for people of a certain class and background. And most of the developers like Mukesh Mehta believe this is what people want. That is what they are imposing.
Yeah, and let's go to the next slide. We will talk maybe more about. See, this is typically so a lot of what is said to be working in terms of slum rehabilitation in Mumbai is on the form of a private-public partnership called Slum Rehabilitation Scheme, and the whole Dharavi redevelopment project is based on that scheme as well. So the idea is that you can go and redevelop one slum. And you put a building in which people are going to live in supposedly better conditions, and in exchange the developer gets some right to develop a building in some other parts of the city which is more valuable. And this building in particular was built 7 years ago. So the conditions are of course deteriorating. It's very hard to build good quality in Mumbai. You need to invest a bit, and often what is being developed as a slum rehabilitation schemes is in this type of very poor quality housing.
And why is this form used? Because again, it is high-rise, and high-rise is seen to be aspirational. If you're high-rise, then it is a modern urban habitat. So that's simply the abstract empty shell of the high-rise is taken as a form, and then slums are transformed into these spaces. But you can see the quality.
But it's cheap as well.
Well, that is debatable.
It's cheap to build, but it's very expensive to maintain. Yeah.
Is this a public social housing or a private?
That was built for pavement dwellers.
Yeah, it's social housing. Social housing.
This is the example of social housing which we have.
But typically what happens is even in the cases in which the apartments are given for free, there is difficulty for people to pay for maintenance. So typically this building has water leakage everywhere, the elevator is not working, and then also what happens is often the economic activities cannot be sustained. A lot of people, we will show that a bit later on, but oftentimes people have an economic activity in their house, which is very hard to do from the 7th floor of a building or the 4th floor. So often people sell out. So
but it's a question of identification with your apartment, and just to get some formal information about it, they get it for free. So
this specific building, yes, yes. And they get.
They only have to pay.
It's a 200
electricity, water, and so on.
Yeah, they have to pay. They have to pay for maintenance.
They allowed to stay with them for free.
Huh?
For how long?
No, it's theirs.
Yes,
It's
They
theirs.
own it.
But it's owned.
yes.
But there's a very important point. Most of them have actually been transformed from a space which is normally a space of work and living. And then they are often relocated into spaces like this, which takes them away from the work. So very often they sell and they move on. That is one limitation of this.
And who owns the ground where this building is standing?
Usually the government,
The government.
usually the state.
Single room apartments?
Huh?
Single room apartments?
Yeah, it's.
25 is non.
Yeah, 225 square foot, so it's about 20 square meter per family. And family can be 6, 7, 10 people. Huh?
How many square meters?
About 20 square meter.
20 square meters.
Yeah. This is still a slum rehabilitation scheme building, but it's a more successful form for one reason, is that the builders have actually consulted with the people who are going to be relocated, and it was a community of people who make papad, which is some type of bread that you can try tonight at the restaurant, and they need some place to dry them up. So they built this large verandas so people could actually keep doing their economic activity. So that as ugly as it looks, it's a more successful example of housing within that scheme. You can go to the next. See, this is now we'll just introduce Dharavi. So the images we showed before, the two buildings are in Dharavi. That's the redevelopment process happening in Dharavi now. And this is the oldest part of Dharavi, which Mustansir Dalvi briefly mentioned, which is the Koliwala village, which maybe I'll let you talk about.
The Kolis, as was earlier mentioned, were one of the oldest habitats in the city. They were fishing. They are a fishing community, and the Koliwada is the habitat of the Kolis. There are several of them all over the city. And what is interesting is that the Koli village, which is often a mix of Hindus and Catholics, because many of them were converted in the 16th century when the Portuguese came. They represent an older layer of history in the city. And these villages became a very interesting place for new working class settlements to emerge, because a lot of the poor who would come to the city would often go towards these villages and get land given out by the members of the village at very cheap rate. And slowly they spread, and many of contemporary slums, the so-called slums in the city, actually find at the core an old village. So in Dharavi, which is one of the biggest villages, you can actually see that the earliest kernel of the habitation over there was Koliwada, this particular village. But as the settlement starts to spread away from the core, you can see that the nature of the habitat changes. It becomes less and less infrastructure rich. the village itself retains some element of the community structures, etc., whereas many of the later settlements lose out. But not always the case. As in the case of Dharavi, you will see that the Kolivada model of the village is reproduced in different neighborhoods. So you will find that there are different neighborhoods which they will be smaller, and there are different kinds of villages, village-like forms which exist and comprise the whole neighborhood of Dharavi.
And, you know, what's interesting also in the case of Mumbai today is that the way people conceptualize the city is very kind of like extreme. It's either the new city, the modern city, which is usually represented by a high-rise building, or the slum. And it's very hard for people to imagine categories in between. And that's why the sites that we've been selecting also for this studio are all those categories in between. They're hard to define in terms of simply being either backward and slummy and low-rise, or modern and high-rise and advanced. So typically that's an example of a place which is surprising, because you go to Dharavi, which has this big reputation of being the biggest slum in Asia, which is of course not true. It's not the biggest in Asia, and it's not even a slum really. So foreigners come and they see that, and they're surprised. Oh, we're not expecting this, And you can go to the next slide. That's some Italian architects who came. Italian architects that came, and they were very surprised. They were like, "Oh, but this looks actually like some of our most favored cities, and cities which drive so much tourism. This kind of like incrementally developed, dense fabric, low-rise, high density. This community feel, it's something that is very kind of common in Europe also." I can go to the next slide. So again, an image of Italy on Kolivada. And you can go to the next slide. And of course, Dharavi has a very, one thing we really want to emphasize is the diversity of a habitat in a city like Mumbai. And even a place like Dharavi is, not just on the one side, the village or the slum. This is a municipal chole. So a chole is a type of barrack which was built by the municipality to accommodate low-income people. This is about 60 years old chole. So it's it's simply a row of a house with one toilet attached to the house. And that's one of the typology you see a lot all over Mumbai, but particularly in Dharavi. You can go to the next slide. And this is an example of, this is the same chole. See, again, it's a row of chole over there. I mean, it used to be, and people have incrementally developed it. So this person, Mr. Nadar, has invested about $40,000 and built up and created a space for him which is about 600 square foot, maybe 60 square meter, more or less, which is much better than what many middle class people get in Dharavi.
How much did he invest it?
About $3,000 to $4,000, yeah.
3,000 to 4,000.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's the story of many neighborhoods in Mumbai. So you can go to the next slide. Another thing which is very important in terms of characterizing many of the parts of Bombay is the extremely vibrant street scene and commercial activity at the street level. So hawkers, street vendors, shops, and the commercial density, if you just count the number of shops in many of the parts of Mumbai, is maximal. I mean, it's almost impossible to find. The space is used to its optimum level. So just you can go to see the next slide. And typically, this is how the house itself, becomes also connected to the street through some type of economic activity. So this is another scene in Dharavi. Yeah, I mean, the market. But it's in Dharavi, but it also could be in many other parts of Mumbai. And they're also very similar to what you can see in many villages on small towns all around Mumbai and the whole state of Maharashtra, for example. And this is just to show an example of how like the optimization of a space available, with the kind of like billboard culture, the ladder. So you can see how in a condition where space is expensive and scarce, you have to be very innovative in terms of coming up with solutions.
We have an office exactly like one of those structures on the first floor, so you can come and climb the stairs.
Yes.
How about the management-wise? What was like
Could you repeat that?
who owns the land?
Whose land is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what place you're talking about, but in the case of Dharavi, there is actually different patterns of ownership. The Chole village that we showed initially, they've been recognized as the owners of the land, the villagers, the Chole village. Other parts of Dharavi, which are considered to be slums, like typically this part, actually this is along a main road, but still this will be considered to be squatting settlements. They consider it squatting on government land. That's the official position towards them, is that they are squatting government land. If you go back to the history of Dharavi, it was a marshy land. It was unbuildable land, and like a lot of Mumbai. And people have come and slowly, incrementally reclaimed that ground. So there was nothing before. So it's hard to say that you've been squatting something which didn't exist, because really the ground was created by people who moved in. But I just want to mention also the type of Las Vegas billboard architecture that we can see also in Dharavi. That's again this kind of like maximization of any space available. That's a typical site. I mean, also it's not typical of Dharavi. It's typical of many small town informal settlements and conditions in Mumbai and the region. Yeah. And
these are sort of different images, once again, to give you close-ups. I mean, for us, it's important to again and again emphasize that there is a space of urbanization which is outside the space of formal architectural and planning practices. And that kind of urbanization also has a logic, and it is a logic which in many ways informs majority of the population. We are talking about 50% of the population of Mumbai who live in settlements like this. So to look and dismiss these settlements as only things which are called slums, which need to be transformed and redeveloped without understanding their logic and the structure, is also very hurried, and it will not necessarily be fruitful in the long run. Because for a city like Mumbai also, to create and construct mass housing projects to the scale of producing 6 million units to satisfy, or at least 2 million units to satisfy 6 million people is unrealistic, utopian and romantic. So why not look at this structure and this form more carefully and see how it can evolve.
So one thing we really want to emphasize, we want to mention, and we would like you to keep in mind, this week, depending like different sites, you'll be working different sites, but it's one thing that we call the Toolhouse, and it's the fact that a lot of houses are also used as productive spaces, and that's a defining characteristic of mixed-use landscapes such as Mumbai. And you'll see this in a lot of unplanned settlements. I mean, that's a typical kind of like default setting. That's just because people need to be productive, and like a huge entrepreneurial spirit of using whatever resources available. Space is one of them, and so often you'll see that the house doubles up as either a place where someone can produce something or sell something, or renting whatever, like space sometimes by the hour. So just the productive dimension of housing. So usually, typically the planning architectural intervention that we've seen so far is one which always segregates living and working, and that's sometimes something which can be create a huge amount of difficulties and problems for people who move in places which are not suited for productive activities. If you go to the next slide. We just want to mention that this condition of living and working is something which is both traditional, that we can see in many Asian cultures. That's an image of in Japan, an artisan. It's the space of the artisan. This is an image right now on the top of a roof of a building in Mumbai, where there's this type of village setting and people work in the houses. And that's contemporary Tokyo, but it could also be it's kind of like the home office, that we see everywhere from Tokyo to New York and Berlin. This condition of living and working coming again together. So sometimes something that we could consider as backward. Just on kind of like this kind of like a knee-jerk direction. It's like, oh, this place is backward. People are, working and living in the same space. Is maybe sometimes some space which should also be seen as being advanced. It also says something about, a future. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, that's another debate. But it's a form which is actually relevant to the type of lifestyles that we have these days.
And we have written an essay which is coming out this year in a book in memory of Jane Jacobs about speculative and intensive uses of land and space in a city. So while a certain kind of the city produces value through speculation, this activity also produces value, but through use. So this is what we are trying to say, that you can create value in space in all kinds of ways. Speculation is one kind, and intensity is the other kind. And intensive use is what the Toolhouse represents. So for us, that's a very important thing. We also talk about the fact that one of the most enduring figures and influence in India has been the figure of Gandhi. And Gandhi has hated cities, and he constantly talks about the village in India as the sort of ultimately utopian habitat. And when you look at his village very carefully, the Gandhian village, it's actually a very hard-working village. Everybody is working industriously in his village. And then when you realize that the kind of model he has for a village is really the artisanal village. And you look at the artisanal village, and it thrives in slums of Mumbai and many other cities. So the village is now, the Gandhian village of sorts, is now very much alive in many urban spaces and urban centers. And we want to break through the fixed notion of what is the village and what is the city, because it does not make sense for a majority of the population in India who live in habitats like these.
Next slide.
Yeah.
So again, I mean, that's typical image of a workshop, intensive workshop happening in a living space. Go next slide. And just to, just so you don't have this idea that, this is only, it's a slum thing, right? Like people work and live in the same place in the slum. The image we just saw before, is, in this house. And this house is in Kotachiwadi. So this, Portuguese heritage hamlet. And if you go to, this is a 200-story old house. It's a Portuguese bungalow. If you go to the next slide, this is inside the house. It's the house of James Ferreira, who's one of the topmost fashion designer in India. And of course, those who will be in Kotachiwadi will be able to visit his house and talk to him and everything. And he also uses his house as a tool house. So it's a condition which often is part of preserving some type of lifestyles and environments. And if you go to the next slide, this is another example in Kotachiwadi of a house which has a productive activity. It's a gym, and people live upstairs. And the fact that they just decided to convert the ground floor into a gym in order to keep the house, because otherwise they could not maintain even the house. So they had to turn the house into a productive space in order to maintain it. So that's the idea also that sometimes preservation is about change and adaptive evolutions of space. If you go to the next slide, we'll do there's another just to show you a bit the kind of like landscape of Kotachiwadi, again Indo-Portuguese architecture. You can go next slide. Yeah, that's another street. Also, it's also extremely mixed use.
This is one of the sites which we are encouraging you to also choose.
Yeah. Next slide. Okay. And again, just to show the variety of use. So you have this on type of habitats, diversity of habitat. This is an old Portuguese bungalow. This is a new, actually very ugly hotel which came out recently. This is like shack, a little slummy structure over there, hidden by the trees. All this coexists. And maybe just want to say one thing about diversity of habitat.
Yeah. So essentially, for us, one of the most important things is how do you accept the fact that cities and urban spaces do not necessarily have to represent the idea of cosmopolitanism and cultural diversity in terms only of communities, but also of habitats. Why can't we also talk about different kinds of habitats as representing the notion of diversity? So can we say that the cities of the future should be cities in which a great diversity of habitats exist? And if you actually accept that, then cities like Mumbai actually should have a huge advantage, because they have not really overbuilt. They have not been burdened by, say, the last 100 years of overdevelopment. There is still a lot of scope for evolution and for a great variety of habitats to emerge. So the notion that, and it's very important, because in a city like Mumbai, you actually, you often collapse all the diversity into two forms, the slum and the skyscraper. This is a gross oversimplification. Mumbai is got a huge variety of habitats in between the slum and the high rise, and that is something which we need to emphasize and focus on.
Yeah, I think
okay. Yeah.